Ego is a disease, but it contains its own cure. This is a quote from the Asa Ki Vaar, or the Ballad of Hope, which is a part of the Guru Granth Sahib, the central scripture of the Sikh religion. But what does it mean? All spiritual paths are united in arguing that our ego, our sense of I, me, myself, is a disease, which is holding us back in our spiritual development. But what does it mean to say that this disease of ego contains its own cure? To answer this question, we would first need to discuss what is the role of the ego in spiritual life. Of course, the ego is a problem, but could it also play a role in spirituality? Could there be a spiritual ego? The 20th century Tibetan master Chögyam Trungpa has argued in his book Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism that the ego plays a highly deceptive role in spiritual life. This is because whenever we associate our spiritual states with the ego, that leads to our spiritual experience becoming reduced down to a material experience. Michael J. Formica, in an article for Psychology Today, puts it as follows. Ego is what defines our roles in the material world. We are a mother, a daughter, a brother, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. By defining our roles in the conscious realm, the ego is hell-bent on drawing us off our sense of the self within the superconscious realm. The more we identify ourselves with the I, the less we are able to identify with the witness. So, even when we are going through spiritual practices to rid ourselves of the ego, whenever we experience something that we may choose to term as a spiritual experience, this labeling of the experience is also done by the ego. And this labeling ruins the spiritual experience. Formica writes, as soon as we cast something into a role, as soon as we put a label on it, as soon as we name it and give it life by virtue of our investment, that is the ego, we take away all its power and it is nothing more than an event. It is no longer a spiritual revelation, but simply a material experience. This is spiritual materialism at its peak. This reminds us of one of the first lines of the famous Chinese spiritual texts, the Tao Te Ching. The Tao is that which cannot be named. True spiritual experience is unnameable, and the ego ruins that by ascribing a name and form to every experience. In this video, we will do a deep dive into the concept of spiritual materialism and the role of the ego in spiritual life. Later in this video, we will talk about the concept of spiritual bypassing and the advice of the 19th century mystic Sri Ramakrishna on how to use our ego for spiritual purposes rather than against them. In his book, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, the Tibetan Buddhist teacher and developer of the idea of crazy wisdom, Chögyam Trungpa, argues that individuals can become attached to their spiritual experiences and practices, ultimately using them to reinforce their ego rather than to transcend it. This makes his insights particularly relevant in modern capitalist society, where spirituality, just like everything else, is commodified and commercialized for profit. But why do individuals commodify their own spiritual experiences? Trungpa argues that spiritual materialism occurs when individuals approach spirituality as a means of achieving personal gain, instead of seeking genuine enlightenment. Indeed, even meditation has become a status symbol in today's society and not a means for achieving enlightenment. Many people show off their meditation or yoga on social media just to seek validation from others. We may wonder how this phenomenon of social media has worsened the state of spiritual materialism in the world, even when compared to Trungpa's time. Let's consider a specific example of spiritual materialism. Trungpa argues that individuals can become attached to this idea of being a spiritual person, and they may have a very narrow understanding of what the lifestyle of a spiritual person should be like and how such a person should behave towards others. But in reality, when people follow such norms, they're not being their genuine selves and are in fact only following the directions of their ego, telling them how to act. They're ultimately seeking validation from others so that others may recognize them as a great spiritual person. But in fact, when we look at the lives of actually great spiritual persons or saints, we often find them behaving contrary to the expectations of our ego on how a great spiritual person should live. In the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, it is often found that he would argue like a child and even cry when he would feel physical pain. In fact, the best example of a great spiritual personage acting contrary to our expectations is Chögyam Trungpa himself. After all, he was the person who coined the term crazy wisdom, the idea that enlightened beings often act contrary to all expectations we would have from not merely a spiritual person, but even an ordinary, sane human being. In his book, Trungpa emphasizes that the spiritual path should be about letting go of the ego rather than feeding it. Accumulating spiritual knowledge or experiences should not lead to a false sense of superiority or entitlement, as that can just hinder our spiritual development even further. Another aspect of spiritual materialism is when we compare our achievements with others. Here, if we step back from the comparisons for a second and take a non-dual perspective to things, we should ask, who am I and who is the person with whom I'm comparing my spiritual progress? We are all one, and all of us will one day realize that we are that one, Tad Ekam, which the Vedas and all subsequent scriptures have described. Taking this perspective would allow us to be happy for the spiritual developments of others instead of looking upon them with envy, which is ultimately a function of the ego. One of the key teachings in Trungpa's work is the importance of seeing things as they are. This involves cultivating awareness and mindfulness, allowing practitioners to recognize their motivations and attachments. By doing so, individuals can begin to dismantle the barriers created by their ego and approach spirituality with a sense of openness and humility. It is this cultivation of humility which is ultimately the antidote to our ego. Humility, however, is a function of the sattva guna. Later in this video, we will also discuss what it means to have more sattva guna in daily life. We understand that getting rid of our ego is a big achievement, but it seems to be very far away. What can we do right now to reduce our ego and thus rid ourselves of spiritual materialism? Sri Ramakrishna had a unique advice for this question. He once said, as recorded in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, "The I that makes one worldly and attaches one to lust and greed is the rascal I." One or two can get rid of this I consciousness or the ego by experiencing samadhi, but usually I-ness does not go. You may reason 1,000 ways, but this I-ness still finds its way back to you. So if I does not go, let the rascal remain as the servant I. O Lord, you are my master. I am your servant. Live with this attitude. I am the servant. I am the devotee. There's no harm in this kind of I-ness. He says here that there are two kinds of ego or I, the rascal ego and the servant ego. So if we cannot get rid of our ego, we should adopt the servant ego and let go of the rascal ego. One should note, however, that this teaching only applies in the context of bhakti yoga, where one adopts the perspective of being a servant. In the context of jnana yoga or even non-theistic traditions like Buddhism, which was the context for Chögyam Trungpa's writings, the servant ego is, in most cases, not possible. Instead, the ego may hype itself up based on an individual's spiritual achievements. But let us step back for a second and analyze Ramakrishna's recommendation here. This video began with a quote from the Asa Ki Vaar, or the Ballad of Hope. Ego is a disease, but it contains its own cure. It appears that in the above passage, Ramakrishna has explained this quote, "Our ego, our feeling of I-ness, is indeed a disease holding us back spiritually. However, it contains its own cure. The ego can be transformed in relation to the divine. Instead of saying, 'I am a wealthy man,' we can say, 'I am a servant of God.' While the ego is retained by the statement, it is only retained in relation to the individual's spiritual relationship with the Absolute." But even if we were to follow this recommendation, there is another way in which the ego can create a problem in the spiritual path. This is through the problem of spiritual bypassing. By spiritual bypassing, we mean instances when someone has had a very meager experience and claims that that experience has made them enlightened. For example, someone who feels a certain sensation in their forehead while meditating starts to claim that their third eye has been opened. Another example of spiritual bypassing is when we start doing advanced practices for which we are not well prepared, instead of doing preparatory practices for the same. A good example of this is provided by the phenomenon of modern Advaita Vedanta. A lot of groups today claim that Brahman can be realized immediately by anyone with the phenomenon of spontaneous awakening. However, if we go back to the traditional form of Advaita Vedanta with Adi Shankaracharya, he wrote that there were multiple preparatory practices which must be constantly practiced in order to reach the final stage of realizing Nirgun Brahman. In his Aparokshanubhuti, Shankara gives the threefold practice of Shravan, or listening to sacred teachings like the Mahavakyas or great teachings of the Upanishads, Manan, which is reflecting on these teachings, and Nididhyasan, or contemplating the teachings through personal experience. Once all three have been perfected, only then can an individual realize Brahman. So it does not make sense to believe within the doctrine of Advaita Vedanta that a person can spontaneously, without any spiritual practice, realize Nirgun Brahman. The same caution against spiritual bypassing has also been given by Sri Ramakrishna. He cautioned his disciples that the most important practical step for all spiritual aspirants is the development of sattva. The sattva guna, one of the three gunas in the Sankhya philosophy, involves the nature of calmness, tranquility, and humility. If we can develop these qualities in our daily life first, only then can we proceed towards the goal of true spiritual experience. A sattvic person, by definition, also has a limited ego, or only the ego of the devotee that is suggested by Ramakrishna. Hence, only such a person is best suited for deeper spiritual experiences. They will accept these experiences in humility and not use them to boast about their spiritual prowess. In this video, we have discussed several problems surrounding the ego and spiritual materialism. In the end, it can be said that all of us must go behind the disease of our ego and discover the cure in our own way to become more and more sattvic over time. What do you think about spiritual materialism? Let us know in the comments below.